My father built an empire on my mother's fortune. When she died, he married his mistress and erased my existence. I died in a factory accident they staged. I woke up at my mother's funeral, with her will in my hand and a list of everyone who helped kill us. The fire was beautiful. That was my last thought, before the smoke filled my lungs and the flames reached my skin. Beautiful, how something so destructive could be so bright. Beautiful, how the factory my mother had built, the factory that had been her pride, her legacy, her life, could burn so completely. I was 27 when I died. 27 years old, trapped in a building that had been in my family for 3 generations, watching my father's men block the exits while the fire spread. They'd planned it well. A faulty wire. A spark. An accident, they'd call it. Tragic, they'd say. The young heir, cut down before his time. No one would investigate. No one would ask questions. Because my father owned the investigators, the reporters, the courts. He'd spent 20 years building his empire on my mother's fortune, and now he was finishing what he started. I was the last piece. The last reminder that this empire had ever belonged to anyone but him. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to find air, trying to find a way out. But there was no way out. They'd made sure of that. The fire doors were locked. The windows were barred. The emergency exits, the ones my mother had installed, the ones she'd insisted on, the ones she'd said would save lives, had been welded shut. I knew who'd ordered it. I'd known, from the moment the first alarm sounded, that this was the end. Not an accident. Not a tragedy. An execution. I thought about my mother. About the last time I'd seen her, 15 years ago, lying in a hospital bed that was too white, too clean, too final. I'd been 12 years old, holding her hand, watching her fade. "Don't let him take it," she'd whispered. "What I built. What I left you. Don't let him take it." I'd promised her. I'd promised I'd protect her legacy, fight for her company, be the son she deserved. I'd failed. He'd taken everything. The company, the fortune, the life she'd wanted for me. He'd taken it piece by piece, year by year, while I watched and did nothing. He'd married his mistress, brought her into our home, let her raise her son in the rooms that should have been mine. He'd sent me away, boarding school, university abroad, a small apartment in a city far from everything that mattered. He'd made me invisible, forgotten, disposable, and now he was making me dead. The flames reached my chest. My lungs screamed. My vision blurred. "I'm sorry, Mother," I thought. I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger. I'm sorry I couldn't fight. I'm sorry I let him win. Then darkness. Then light. Then my mother's funeral. I opened my eyes to a room I hadn't seen in 15 years. The funeral hall. My mother's funeral. I was 12 years old, sitting in the front row, surrounded by relatives who whispered about inheritance and whispered about my father and whispered about the boy who was too young to understand what he'd lost. But I understood. I understood everything. I looked at my hands. Small, unscarred. The hands of a child who hadn't yet learned to fight. I looked at the casket at the front of the room. My mother's face, peaceful, made up to look like she was sleeping. The face of a woman who'd been poisoned slowly, over years, by the man sitting beside me. My father. He was younger here. 43, still handsome, still charming. He held my hand with practiced tenderness, whispered comfort in my ear, played the grieving husband with the skill of a man who'd been practicing for this moment for years. I didn't pull away. I let him hold my hand. Let him whisper. Let him think I was still the 12-year-old boy who trusted him, loved him, believed his lies. But I was watching. I was waiting. And I was remembering. The funeral lasted 3 days. 3 days of relatives and business associates and politicians, all paying respects to a woman they'd ignored while she was alive. 3 days of my father playing the grieving widower, accepting condolences, accepting control. I watched it all with eyes that had already lived through it once. I watched my father's mistress, his secretary, the woman who'd been sleeping with him for years, stand in the back of the room, wearing black, pretending to mourn. I watched her eyes flick to my father every few minutes, watching him, waiting for him. Her name was Han Soo-jin. She'd been with him since before my mother died. She'd helped him plan everything. I watched my father's lawyer slip him documents during the reception. Transfer papers. Ownership documents. The beginning of the slow erosion of my mother's estate. The lawyer's name was Choi Min-suk. He'd been my father's accomplice for decades. He'd helped forge signatures, bribe officials, bury evidence. I watched my mother's brother, Uncle Huang, try to speak to my father about the will. Watched my father dismiss him with a smile and a promise that meant nothing. Uncle Huang had tried to fight in the first life. He'd hired lawyers, filed complaints, demanded investigations. My father had ruined him, bankrupted him, driven him to suicide. And I remembered all of it. The way my father would slowly, systematically, strip away everything my mother had built. The way he'd transfer assets, forge signatures, silence anyone who asked questions. The way he'd marry Soo-jin within a year, bring her into the house, introduce her as my new mother. The way he'd send me away. Boarding school, then university abroad, then a small apartment in a city far from the company he was dismantling. The way he'd keep me visible enough to avoid suspicion, distant enough to have no power. And finally, 15 years from now, the way he'd decide I was too much of a risk. A loose end. A reminder of the woman whose fortune he'd stolen. The factory fire. The blocked exits. The beautiful, destructive flames. I was 12 years old, sitting at my mother's funeral, and I had 15 years to stop it. I found the will on the third day. It was hidden in my mother's personal effects, a small leather folder, tucked beneath her jewelry, wrapped in a letter addressed to me. I waited until the funeral home was empty, until the mourners had gone home, and the staff had left for the night. Then I slipped into the back room, where my mother's things were stored, and opened the folder. The will was there. 12 pages, single-spaced, drafted by the best lawyers money could buy. It left everything to me. Every share, every property, every one. My father was named as executor, but only until I turned 18. After that, control passed to me. My father had never intended to let me reach 18. In the first life, he'd started transferring assets before my mother's body was cold. By the time I turned 18, there was nothing left to inherit. But there was more. Beneath the will, a letter. My mother's handwriting. The same looping script I'd seen on birthday cards, on school notes, on the margins of books she'd read to me. To my son, Kong Doyan. If you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to protect you. I'm sorry I didn't leave sooner. I'm sorry I trusted your father when I should have trusted my instincts. But I'm not sorry for what I built. The company. The fortune. The future I wanted for you. It's yours now. Every share. Every property, every one. I've made sure of it. Your father will try to take it. He's been trying for years. But the will is ironclad. The lawyers are loyal. And the truth about what he's done, what he's been doing, is in the safety deposit box at the Hana Bank. Account 4473. The password is your birthday. Don't let him take what's yours, Doyan. Don't let him erase me. Don't let him win. I love you. I've always loved you. And I'm watching. I'll always be watching. Mother. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully, tucked it into my jacket, and looked across the room at my father's photograph on the memorial wall. He was smiling. He was always smiling. I smiled too. 15 years, I thought. 15 years to destroy you. Let's see who's smiling at the end. I went to the bank the next morning. I was 12 years old, too young to access a safety deposit box without an adult. But I had my mother's letter, my mother's will, and the birth certificate that proved I was her son. The bank manager, an elderly woman who'd known my mother for decades, took one look at my face and opened the box without question. Inside, a folder, thicker than the will, filled with documents I'd never seen before. Medical records, financial statements, photographs, transcripts of conversations my mother had secretly recorded. Everything she'd gathered in the years before her death. Everything she'd needed to prove what my father was doing. The medical records showed the slow progression of the poison they'd put in her food. Not enough to kill quickly, enough to make her weak, dependent, easy to control. Enough to make it look like illness, like fate, like something no one could have prevented. The financial statements showed the money my father had been siphoning from her accounts for years. Millions, then billions, transferred to shell companies, offshore accounts, the names of people who'd helped him hide the truth. The photographs showed him with Sujin years before my mother's death. At restaurants, at hotels, at the very hospital where my mother was being treated for the illness they'd given her. And the transcripts were the most damning. Conversations my mother had recorded, secretly, over years. My father talking to his lawyer about the will. My father talking to Sujin about the future. My father talking to the doctors about how much longer she had left. I sat in the bank's private room, surrounded by the evidence of my mother's murder, and let myself feel something I'd been suppressing for 15 years. Rage. But I didn't act. Not yet. I was 12 years old. I had no money, no power, no allies. If I went to the authorities now, my father would bury the evidence, silence the witnesses, destroy me before I could fight back. I needed to wait. I needed to prepare. I needed to become someone he couldn't destroy. I closed the folder, returned it to the box, locked it, and walked out of the bank with a plan. The years after my mother's funeral were a performance. I became the son my father wanted, quiet, obedient, grateful. I let him comfort me, control me, shape me into someone who would never ask questions. I let him send me to boarding school, to university abroad, to a small apartment in a city far from the company. I let him think I'd forgotten. But every night, alone in my room, I planned. I studied. I prepared. I read every book on corporate law, on finance, on strategy. I taught myself accounting so I could follow the money. I taught myself law so I could understand the crimes he was committing. I taught myself history so I could learn from the people who'd fought before me. I tracked every transaction my father made, every asset he transferred, every person he silenced. I kept records hidden in encrypted files in safety deposit boxes in the memories of people who remembered my mother and hated what my father had done to her. I built a network, quietly, carefully, over years. People who'd worked for my mother, who'd been pushed out when my father took over. People who'd seen the truth and been silenced. People who were waiting for someone to lead. I found my mother's old allies, the shareholders who trusted her, the executives she'd promoted, the lawyers who drafted her will. Some were scared. Some were bitter. Some were just tired of watching my father destroy everything she'd built. But they remembered her. They remembered what she'd stood for. And when I told them I was going to take back what she'd left me, they listened. Boarding school was my first test. My father sent me to the best school in the country, a place where the sons of Chable families learned to become the men their fathers wanted them to be. He expected me to be like them, entitled, arrogant, uninterested in anything that didn't involve status or money. Instead, I became something else. I studied. I worked. I watched. I learned to read people, their weaknesses, their desires, their secrets. I made friends with the sons of judges, the daughters of politicians, the children of people who would one day be in positions to help me. I didn't use them. Not yet. I just collected them. Built relationships. Earned trust. Became someone people wanted to help, not because of my name but because of who I was. By the time I graduated, I had a network that spanned the country. People who owed me favors. People who believed in me. People who would, when the time came, stand beside me. My father never noticed. He was too busy building his empire, too busy erasing my mother's legacy, too busy raising his new son in the house that should have been mine. He thought I was nothing. He thought I'd forgotten. He thought I was just another rich kid, wasting his education, waiting to inherit a fortune that no longer existed. He was wrong. University abroad was my second test. My father sent me to London, far from the company, far from anyone who might remind him of what he'd stolen. He gave me a generous allowance, a comfortable apartment, and the expectation that I'd spend my years partying and wasting my potential. Instead, I studied. I enrolled in the best business school in the country. I took classes in corporate law, in forensic accounting, in the strategies people use to hide money and power. I wrote papers on corporate governance, on shareholder rights, on the legal frameworks that protected people like my father and destroyed people like my mother. I also started investing. Small amounts at first, money I'd saved from my allowance, money I'd earned tutoring other students. I invested in companies I'd researched, in markets I understood, in opportunities my father would never have considered. Within 3 years, I'd turned my small savings into a portfolio worth millions. Not enough to challenge my father's empire, but enough to start. And I kept building, kept watching, kept waiting. I came home when I was 25. My father didn't want me back. He'd spent 15 years building a life without me, an empire that had no room for the son of the woman he'd killed. But he couldn't refuse me, not without looking suspicious, not without acknowledging the son he'd erased. So he let me come home. He gave me a job in the company, a small one, far from power, far from anything that mattered. He put me in an office in a building I'd never seen, with people who didn't know my name and expected me to disappear. I didn't disappear. I worked. I learned. I watched. I built relationships with the people my father had ignored, the mid-level managers, the factory workers, the people who kept the company running while my father played his games. I listened to their stories, learned their names, earned their trust. And I waited for my moment. My moment came when I was 26. My father was preparing to merge the company with a foreign conglomerate, a deal that would enrich him and his allies, but would destroy the company my mother had built. He'd been planning it for years, hiding the negotiations from the board, from the shareholders, from everyone who might object. But he couldn't hide it from me. I'd been watching for 15 years. I knew every shell company, every offshore account, every person he'd bribed. I had copies of the documents, recordings of the conversations, testimony from the people he'd silenced. And now, I had the merger. I spent 6 months preparing. 6 months of late nights, of lawyers, of building a case that would destroy him. 6 months of reaching out to the allies I'd cultivated, the people who remembered my mother, the ones who'd been waiting for someone to lead. When I was ready, I called a meeting of the board. The boardroom was at the top of the Hanjin Group headquarters, the building my mother had built, the building my father had stolen. I'd been in this room before, as a child, when my mother would bring me to work and let me sit in the corner while she ran the company. Now I was walking in as the enemy. My father was at the head of the table, surrounded by his allies, his lawyers, his men. He smiled when he saw me. The same smile he'd worn at my mother's funeral, the same smile he'd worn when he sent me away. "Doyen," he said. "What a surprise. I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm sure you didn't." He gestured to a seat at the far end of the table. "Please sit. I'm sure whatever this is about, it can wait until after the meeting."
No.
I walked to the center of the room. "It can't wait. And this is the meeting." I opened the folder I'd been carrying, the same folder I'd been building for 15 years, and spread the contents across the table. The medical records, the financial statements, the photographs, the transcripts, the truth. "This is what you did to my mother," I said. "This is how you killed her. Slowly, quietly, while she trusted you, while she loved you, while she was dying in a hospital bed, thinking you were her husband, thinking you were someone who cared." My father's face went white. His lawyers started talking, started objecting, started reaching for the documents. I held up a hand. "Don't bother. I've already filed copies with the courts, with the prosecutors, with every major newspaper in the country. This isn't a negotiation. This is an announcement." I turned to the board, the men and women who'd been my mother's allies, who'd watched her die, who'd done nothing. "You have a choice," I said. "You can stand with him. You can pretend you didn't know. You can watch him destroy this company, the way he destroyed my mother. Or you can do the right thing. You can vote him out. You can give the company back to the people who built it. You can let me rebuild what he destroyed." Silence. Then, slowly, one by one, the board members began to speak. My father didn't go quietly.
He fought. He threatened.
He bribed. He called in every favor he'd ever earned, every ally he'd ever cultivated. He tried to destroy the evidence, discredit the witnesses, bury the story. But I was ready. I'd spent 15 years preparing for this moment. I had copies of everything stored in safety deposit boxes across the country. I had testimony from people he'd silenced, witnesses he'd threatened, allies he'd betrayed. I had the truth, and the truth was something he couldn't fight. Within a month, the board voted him out. Within 3 months, the prosecutors indicted him for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. Within a year, he was in prison, where he would spend the rest of his life. I visited him once before the trial. He was in a holding cell, waiting for his bail hearing, looking older than I'd ever seen him. The charm was gone. The confidence was gone. He was just a man facing the consequences of his choices. "Why?" he asked. "I gave you everything. A life, an education, a future. Why couldn't you just disappear?" I looked at him, the man who'd killed my mother, who'd tried to kill me, who'd spent 20 years erasing us from history, and felt nothing. "Because I'm not you," I said. "Because she loved me. Because she trusted me to protect what she built. Because I'm her son, and you're nothing." I turned to leave. "Doyen." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. For your mother. For what I did. For..." "Don't." I looked back. "Don't apologize. You're not sorry. You're just scared. And I don't need your apologies. I never needed anything from you." I walked out. I never saw him again. I spent the next 5 years rebuilding the company. It was harder than I'd expected. My father had spent 15 years hollowing out the company, transferring assets, enriching himself and his allies. There was almost nothing left of what my mother had built. But I rebuilt it, slowly, piece by piece, with the help of the people who'd believed in me. I brought back the workers my father had fired. I reinvested in the factories he'd closed. I built new partnerships, new products, and new futures. And I changed the way the company worked. I created programs for workers, for their families, for the communities where our factories were located. I built schools and hospitals and housing not because it was good business, but because it was right. Because my mother would have wanted it that way. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, I visited my mother's grave. I brought flowers, white roses, her favorite. I sat beside her headstone and told her about the company, about the people we'd helped, about the future we were building. "I kept my promise," I said. "I didn't let him take it. I didn't let him win." The wind rustled through the trees. The sun was warm on my face. "I miss you," I whispered. "I miss you every day. But I'm okay. I'm okay because of you.
Because you loved me.
Because you prepared me. Because you never stopped fighting, even when you knew you were going to lose." I stayed until the sun set. Then I walked back to my car, drove back to the city, and went back to work. I never married. I never had children.
People found that strange.
The heir to a fortune, the CEO of a major company, the man who'd rebuilt an empire. Surely he'd want someone to carry on his name. But I'd had a family, and they'd killed me. So I built my own family. The people who worked for me, who believed in me, who helped me build something better. The young leaders I trained, the programs I started, the futures I created for people who'd been forgotten. I built scholarships in my mother's name, programs for young women who wanted to start their own businesses, grants for families who'd been hurt by the kind of greed that destroyed my mother. And I made sure that no one would ever be erased the way my father tried to erase us. To the son who will read this someday, my name is Kong Doyen. My mother built an empire. My father destroyed it. I spent 15 years taking it back. I'm writing this because I know there are others like me. Others who've been erased. Others who've been told they're nothing, that they don't matter, that they should disappear. Others who are waiting for someone to show them how to fight. You don't need permission to fight. You don't need power. You don't need money. You need the truth, and you need the courage to speak it. Find the evidence. Build your network. Wait for your moment. And when it comes, don't hesitate. Don't apologize. Don't let them tell you you're too young, too weak, too alone. You're not alone. I'm with you. My mother is with you. Everyone who's ever been erased is with you.
Fight.
Build.
Win.